Welcome everyone to Nerd of the Rings. I've got a very special guest with me today, Mr. Charlie Vickers. You know him as Sauron from the Rings of Power. Charlie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's jump right into it. We get to meet Annatar this season.
Yeah.
Love that we get to use the name Annatar.
Yeah.
Now, Annatar's demeanor and presence seem quite different than what we saw in season one, obviously. I'm curious, did you approach Annatar almost as if you're playing a different character?
I suppose on the outside, yes, but internally, no. Because I think the one thing that I really wanted to establish that is that Annatar is still Sauron in the same way that Halbrand is Sauron. And while physically I was able to play with moving differently and talking differently and obviously appearing differently, I wanted him to have the same internal drive and motivation that Halbrand did. So everything, I think the kind of trick was making him a different character, but trying to link it to the same core goals that Sauron has. And not just making things different for the sake of it being different. And I nearly made that mistake. I started out thinking, well, Annatar has to be completely different in every way to Halbrand. And the more that we went through the process of developing the character over months, I realized in conjunction with the showrunners when I chatted to them that there were actually quite a few similarities. And like the voice, I started off, he had this kind of, we never filmed it, but in rehearsals had kind of, the voice was quite high pitched.
Oh, really?
And that was just something I was exploring. And then the showrunners came to me after a rehearsal and they said, maybe try and drop it to a similar register to Halbrand and see what happens. And that kind of unlocked the character vocally. So yeah, the same but different.
Yeah. I like when he kind of loses his cool, you like drop it down even more there.
Yeah, and there are sometimes, when I've watched things back, sometimes I see it and I see moments of Halbrand in Annatar, and I think that's probably just because they're both me, right? And there are some things that no matter how hard I try, I can't get rid of them.
Now, when we were at San Diego Comic-Con a while back, we talked a bit off camera about you finding out, you're playing Sauron, kind of diving into Tolkien's writings. I'm curious, what sources did you find most helpful or most interesting when you were looking into this character?
There's so much stuff, as you know, better than anyone. There's a massive, I drew on the Silmarillion, I would say the most. That was where I started.
Yeah.
And because I didn't know I was playing Sauron, I kind of started there to try and establish the world in my mind and try and make sure this Halbrand character could fit in it. And then when I found out I was Sauron, I was like, there's so much stuff now that I can really sink my teeth into. So, I spent a lot of time going through the Silmarillion, but then I really focused on the Akallabeth and of the Rings of Power and then stories like Beren and Luthien, but really intensely looking at the books, I love the story, Beren and Luthien, and then going through all the different iterations of it. And when I found out that Sauron was originally Tevildo, and it's like, what? I mean,
I feel like that would be really stretching you as an actor.
I know,
if we
maybe,
got Tevildo.
Maybe season 3, come back as a cat. And then Tolkien's letters as well, because he and we talked about this a bit in San Diego, but he was so They're personal letters and professional letters, and he really talks in depth about how he sees Sauron and how he functions in the world and within the story. So it was nice to try and see what his opinion of the character was and how I could bring that to this story, I suppose.
Now, in episode 8, at the finale, we have this great moment between Sauron and Celebrimbor. And Celebrimbor, I love that he, with the foresight of death, he makes this proclamation to Sauron, and he calls him a slave to the rings, which I feel like it's a pretty cool way to look at Sauron's relationship with the rings. Obviously, we know him as the Lord of the Rings and the, kind of a master over the rings, but it's kind of a cool restructuring of that relationship that he has with the rings, because ultimately his after he creates the one, he's bound to that in a way. So what are your thoughts on the kind of this reframing of Sauron as a slave to the rings?
I think it's an interesting concept because ultimately and we see at least in the way that the show interprets the magic of the rings as the season goes on, and you see he starts to contribute more and more of his own being into their creation. And it was never really, you probably know the details more than me on this, but the actual specifics of ring creation are never really explored that much in the books. And I think it's a really smart thing that they did that, Sauron uses a bit of his own blood to have power and influence over the rings, but in turn, it kind of it eternally binds him to them. And his kind of quest and drive to heal and save Middle-earth, the fact that he's using the rings for this purpose kind of in turn makes him a slave to them. And he is forever, and we see it with the One Ring. He puts so much of his power and binds so much of that into the ring, and then in order to have control over these other rings, that without it, he kind of crumbles and is very vulnerable. So, and I think in that moment, Celebrimbor saying that pisses Sauron off. And you see the result of it. But it's like a home truth, and I think him hearing that is it really touches something within him, like touches a nerve.
Hits a nerve there. We see Sauron go from deception mode into like pulling strings and undermining Celebrimbor and everything. But then we get these great moments, and I promise I'm not like some sadistic guy who just loves seeing Sauron do evil things, but it's part of the character, so I kind of like seeing it. But we see this ruthlessness as he like just casually dispenses with elves, orcs. Is it kind of fun to turn that on and like play the just outright straight up bad guy that just doesn't care about anybody?
I think that it was a really enjoyable shoot, and that's you're right, it makes you sound crazy because you're just enjoying like killing a lot of people on screen, but there is something really, really interesting about playing a complex character that is at the point where he's descended fully into, he has succumbed to temptation in that way. He has succumbed to evil, and it's kind of, I thought about it particularly in the last episode as it's taking him over now, and it's becoming, he has fully kind of relapsed in that sense. If there was any kind of hope or light that existed within him, even if that light can be interpreted as like creativity with Celebrimbor and the light that he had in conversations with Galadriel in the first season, he has descended. And to let that manifest in blind rage is really interesting. And the challenge for me was to have those things, those acts of violence, but tie them to that the psychology, which is difficult when you're playing a god, right? Like a demigod, because but ultimately all we can do is bring our humanity to it, right? I bring my humanity to, even though I'm not playing a human, and everyone watching it is viewing it through the prism of humanity.
Now, obviously, season 2 just finished, but looking ahead, what excites you most about the future for Sauron?
I mean, I am incredibly excited about the fall of Numenor. That's the bit of that was the bit of the Silmarillion reading in the Akallabeth. When you read it, it leaps off the page. The sacrifice. I was going to say human sacrifice. I guess it kind of is Numenorians. That in the temple, and then the fall of the island, and it's that bit of the show that I can't wait to see on screen. So in terms of Sauron's journey, I think it's quite unique in that his journey is very specifically mapped out by Tolkien throughout this time period. There's gaps, but he is involved in all the major events of the age.
All the bad stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And everything kind of revolves around the bad stuff. So I'm really excited for those bits, and
Yeah.
in particular the downfall of Numenor and the whispering in Pharazôn's ear
Yeah.
and stuff. And I'm really looking forward to having the same kind of dialogue. Charlie and I had so much fun this season,
Yeah.
and there will be an element of that. I don't know in what season, but with Tristan.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, he seems primed and ready for you to start whispering in his
Oh
ear,
yeah,
for sure.
yeah. Even if he doesn't know it yet.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your schedule to chat Sauron with us.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.